We'll get started. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man tabi'ahum bi isanin ila yawmiddin wa ba'd. This evening, what we're going to do as a starter for this program is we're going to look at some what I consider important background information. We're looking at, of course, Imam Al-Wasiti, rahimahullah ta'ala, and he lived during the latter part of the 7th or latter half of the 7th century of the Islamic calendar. So he was born in 657 of the Hijra calendar. He passed away in 711. And he traveled around quite a bit, but he was born in Iraq, and he was born in a time which was very unstable in the Muslim world. And I think it's important that we touch on a couple of key points about the context of his life, because what we'll come to find out, and for those of you that have been around reviewing some of his works here as a collective, my hope is that you'll begin to identify some of what seem to be factors for his program or framework or things that he stressed perhaps more than others in his writings. You know, things we hear a lot of times, not things aren't things don't happen in a vacuum. And so to understand kind of what was going on during that time, I feel is not only important, but it's also quite interesting. Okay, so Imam Al-Wasiti. Wasit is the actual name of the region that he was born in. Wasit is like a kind of a district, if you will. It's a general city, I guess, in southern Iraq. And this is located between Kufa and Basra. And at the time, it was kind of like a garrison city, if you will. And that region, believe it or not, is in a marsh area. When you think of Iraq, you probably think of like desert, right? But Iraq has a very vast marshland, especially in the southern part of it. And if you're interested, and it's quite unique, you could look it up on your phone. Just write marshlands of southern Iraq. And it's actually gotten some attention recently in the conservation world, like nature conservation, because that part of Iraq is considered what they often refer to as the cradle of life. And it's a profoundly historic region. But what's unique about it is that, as you might think marshland, it's essentially a bunch of channels, waterways. And they would, of course, live along those little waterways and channels, even erecting huts, and some of them are still there today, along these little tiny patches of marshland. And so it's basically a very rural environment, not like the cities of Baghdad or Kufa or Basra, the like metropolitan areas even for that time. This is like you're out in the countryside, you're out in the marshlands, it's like you're out in the sticks. And that's an important point that Imam Al-Wasiti actually will draw our attention to in his own kind of autobiographical work that we're going to look at as well together. So that gives you kind of a context in terms of the region and how it looked. But during the time, the late 6th to early 7th century of the Hijra calendar, that region was experiencing political turmoil, instability, which had an impact on the spiritual life of the people. So if you know about Islamic history, you know that there were the Khulafa al-Rashidun. These are the great companions of the Prophet ﷺ. And then after their time in power, it transitioned to what is known as the Umayyad dynasty. And after that dynasty, essentially, it went into the Abbasid dynasty. And this was present during his life. It existed, nominally so, in Baghdad, was kind of the capital there. And so the Abbasid dynasty around this time was now just like puppets to military parties that came in and essentially would take control. They would leave the leader installed there, but they essentially would be running things and calling the shots. They had basically become very symbolic. Essentially, they were politically impotent. Okay? Baghdad, as many of you may know, was considered the jewel of the Islamic world. At one point, it was a thriving capital. It was the center, not only of rule in the Muslim world, but also of culture and knowledge. It was like the scholar's city. But around this time, before Imam Al-Wasiti is born in 657, it's now declining. And again, due to the political instability, and there's various struggles, power struggles that happen. There's various religious movements that come in and really impact the community's religious life. And now, Baghdad is getting ready to face an invasion by the Mongols. And they actually begin their move toward the Islamic world, Baghdad in particular, between 641 and 655 of the Hijra calendar. Remember, Imam Al-Wasiti is born in 657. Okay, so they start to advance westward, and they're essentially going to go and take over and destroy everything in their way. They want to push deep into the Muslim heartlands. And so by 656, this is when they reach Baghdad and basically sack the city. It was a devastation. The Abbasid dynasty basically came to an end. The Khalifa Al-Mu'tasim, who was executed, and the Mongols massacred hundreds of thousands of citizens, destroyed much of the city's infrastructure, including many of the libraries that housed Islamic knowledge and a tremendous legacy of scholarship. And of course, the Mongols, as you may know, they continued. They didn't stop in Baghdad. They advanced further all the way into Syria, northern parts of the Mesopotamia. This went on from 657 to 659. Of course, Wasit was there, southern Iraq. Imam Al-Wasiti, born right after that, would be affected by the conditions that were left in the wake of such devastation and destruction, including all of the institutions. You have to remember that, like, the government was sponsoring a lot of religious institutions, educational and otherwise, and now that's no longer centralized. And of course, the Mongols, they continue on. Eventually, they end in battle with the Mamluks, who defeat them during a battle which is called Ain Jalut. This was in Palestine. It's considered like a marvel, a military marvel of sorts, based on the might, strength, and the sheer numbers of the Mongols versus the Mamluks. However, the Mamluks, they were victorious, and essentially they put a stop to them from taking over in that region. The Mongols, they remained, however, in Iraq, in control for a number of years, several decades in fact, and then their rule waned and eventually was lost. So a couple things to note about, that's kind of like the political scene, what was happening, power shifting, instability. Also have to think about Islamic scholarship during that time. As I mentioned, it was once the scholar's city. It was a capital for knowledge and instruction. It was, of course, declining at this point, becoming very weak, almost absent. It didn't mean that there weren't scholars that were still present. There very much were, but their role changed drastically. Imam Al-Wasiti talks about that to some extent in his autobiography. And coupled with that, during that time, we're talking about 7th century Iraq, and prior to that, a number of Sufi orders began to emerge. And these movements often emphasized ritual, emotional devotion, and came with some rather outlandish claims from their leaders. They're often referred to as the Sheikh of a Tariqah. Imam Al-Wasiti, of course, his father was Sheikh Ibrahim of the Tariqah Ahmadiyya, Al-Rifa'iyya. Okay, we're going to talk about that shortly. And so, as these movements, these Sufi orders began to arise, and they arose, I believe, because they were filling a void in the communities. And they gained tremendous momentum in rural areas where life was simple. You didn't have a big presence of scholarship there, and yeah, it just takes root. And we might find some parallels for that even in our own world today, where you can find strange religious practices happening, not in like metropolitan areas, but you got to get kind of out into the sticks where you start to see some crazy things going down. Okay? So, some of the reasons we're going to look at here, but just as a hint at them, when it came to the scholarly class, at this point in their history, they were rather disconnected from the public because they were preoccupied with debates, high-level debates in philosophy and in speculative theology, etc. There were a lot of sectarian rivals that were happening during that time from different groups and factions. And then the jurists, the fuqaha, they were often entangled with religious rulings that were dealt with or used to entertain the elite of their society. They were not connected to like the grassroots of their communities. And so those communities lacked spiritual mentorship. It's basically left kind of a gap there. And then there was some social elements as well that were happening. It was kind of a social breakdown, and public distrust began to develop. You know, there were the invasions, there was taxation, heavy taxation, there was factional violence that would constantly be ravaging the cities and towns of Iraq. The people began to lose trust in their religious leadership and their institutions. And essentially, the everyday Muslim was attracted to charismatic leadership. They were drawn to spiritual slogans and communal ritual. And because they were just your everyday common Muslim, they lacked knowledge to be able to vet those leaders and to understand the types of worship that they were being introduced to and eventually adopting. Not certain whether or not it was authentic based in the Quran, Sunnah, or otherwise. All right, so when we think about Sufism in general, and especially in this context, we have to understand that the study, or if we were to say the science of Suluk or Tasawwuf, is rooted in Islam. It's rooted in the concept. You can find it generally, the understanding of it, in the hadith of Jibreel alayhi salam. Right? When you have the Prophet ﷺ visited by the angel amongst his companions, and he asks him about Islam, and he answers with the 5 pillars of Islam. That represents the outward acts. That represents the fiqh of our religion. That there's prayer, there's fasting, there's zakat, there's hajj. And then he asks him about iman, and he addresses that or answers that question with the 6, what we call the 6 articles of faith: belief in Allah, angels, messengers, books, etc. And that's dealing with the aqidah, our doctrine or belief as Muslims. And then he asks about ihsan, and the Prophet ﷺ, he said to worship Allah as if you see him, and if you can't do that, then you know that he sees you. And this ihsan is where you find the spirit of what has been called tasawwuf or suluk. It's the spiritual aspect of our tradition. And when the science or the study of it began to develop and to become formalized, it was never intended as an alternative to the Sharia. but it was meant to be married hand in hand. They all have to be working together, the trifecta, right? You have what we say, Islam, Iman, and Ihsan, right? So it goes together, integral pieces that form a complete unit, if you will. And during this time of Imam Al-Wasiti, or prior to that as well, leading up to his time, Sufism began to emerge, and as I alluded to, in response to a number of very urgent needs. And this is during that time when the religious and moral standards were in turmoil, and structured teaching and guidance was now scarce. And so the people were naturally drawn to those who could appeal to the need of the moment. When you're in a war-torn area, where there's poverty, where there's calamity, where there's hardship, you need something that will speak to your heart, something that will awaken you spiritually. And so there are a number of specific factors that play into this emergence of Tasawwuf in Iraq during this time, and some of them have to do with religious and intellectual causes, some of them are ethical and spiritual, some of them are social, and there have been studies that have been done about this particular topic. And I'm just going to mention two major causes that Imam Al-Wasiti kind of addresses in his work. And the first one is that this turn towards Sufism, or the Sufi orders, was, as I mentioned, due to an absence of genuine representation of Islam, both in what's being said and what's being practiced, what's being done. Like a genuine representative, like a leader, like a spiritual religious leader, is not really available for people. The educational institutions, as I mentioned, they failed to meet the people's spiritual and behavioral needs among all these crises, etc. And the reason for that is because many of the scholars were preoccupied in debate, dispute, argumentation, high-level discussions about minutia, okay, detailed matters that were kind of over the heads of the congregation and the community. And a lot of the heart-centered education and the moral reform, they were neglected. Imam Al-Wasiti describes this imbalance. And he says, the people possess jurisprudence. He's talking about the fuqaha, the jurists, right, those that are knowledgeable in the matters of legal code. He says, they possess fiqh, la ghayr. That's it. Nothing else. He said, their temperaments are rigid, their hearts devoid of the fragrances of Allah's love, devoid of reverence toward Him and longing for Him. One does not sense from them the scent of servitude, nor honesty in dealings, nor sincerity therein. So there was a kind of a dryness to them. And in contrast to that dryness, the general public, they found that the Sufis, in their gatherings, they saw it as a means to draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because they're not just dealing about legal rulings and dry discussion. Now they're talking about doing something that kind of arouses the human spirit, addresses that need for closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even if some of the gatherings, they contained innovations, because the gatherings were typically very emotionally warm and would lead to having like hope spiritually, having spiritual hope, if you will, then this was what was missing in those circles of the jurists. This is what was missing in that, that scholarly community. On top of, so what are they hearing? It's not just what they were hearing from the two different groups. The dysfunction within this scholarly elite wasn't just about what they were saying, but it was also about what they were doing. Involved in corruption and moral decay. This had spread among the judges and the governors. And many remained silent in the face of clear wrongs. When they would have a munkar, they would see a munkar, they would be silent. And this is something that we've been discussing in the previous sessions about al-amr bil-ma'ruf and nahy al-munkar, enjoining the good and forbidding the evil. And so during this time, you're seeing someone you think represents religion. Not only are they not speaking out against evil, but some of them are partaking in it as well. And so the dignity of the Sharia was lost at the hands of those who were supposed to protect it and safeguard it, the fuqaha. And so what happened? The people began to lose trust in those who were supposed to be their religious examples. Imam Al-Wasiti interacted with a number of this community, not only the jurists, but also those that were known to be worshippers. Like, they're not scholarly elite, but they're very religious. They have a level of religiosity. And what I mean by that is they adhere to the practices of Islam and the code of law. It might not be that there's a real spiritual depth that's there, but on the outside it looks like we would say, he's got a beard. He prays in the masjid. He attends Jummah prayer. Those types of outward practices that you see, and then you'll hear, but they're no better than anyone else, because guess what? Sometimes that image is also has a void, and they're involved in sinful behavior. So Imam Al-Wasiti, he describes these qualities after his encounter not only with the fuqaha, but with those that were among this class of people, the religiously inclined. They were often referred to as impoverished worshippers, because typically they lived a life of outward practice of worship, and they weren't really out there, making money or a career for themselves. And this was in Baghdad, after he had left his community in Wasit. He said they were committed to the Sharia more so than many of the jurists. However, they were overwhelmed with desires. He says most of their aspirations revolved around shahawat. Most of their goals had to do with, these carnal desires. Companionship with the wealthy, forming close friendships with them, joking with them, and seeking their company and the gifts that they would give them. You need these wealthy people. If you are into the dunya, but you're still in this class of people we're just the worshipers. Like, I'm not working a lot, I'm doing the worship thing, but I have a craving for the dunya, so I have to latch on to a community of people that, if I make them feel good and entertain them and spend some time, they're going to give. I'm going to enjoy. I'll be there. They're going to host. They're having parties. They're having social gatherings. I'm going to eat the free food. So again, you see a kind of a contradiction of sorts as we today note ourselves. This religious person is that's the kind of the avatar. There's this religious avatar. It's typically like it's the uncle, the beard, the topi, but then he's rough and harsh with his family. He's difficult to get along. He's not trustworthy in financial dealings, etc. And just kind of like, oh, these people are no better than we are. Right, so this is kind of what Imam Al-Wasiti was alluding to here, is you're seeing this contradiction within what appears to be the religious representation. And so here we have an absence of divine guidance. We have an absence or a weakness in spiritual education, and then the preoccupation of the religious leaders with disputes. Also within that scholarly class, there was rivalries that were happening. If you imagine like a university system where, you're vying for position, who's going to be the tenured professor, there's only 3 seats for that, and so there's 9 of us, And so now we've got to be opponents to one another as opposed to like serving the deen. Now we're serving ourselves. Because I want to be the one that sits in the chair and not you. I want to be tenured. I want to get the salary. I want to get the recognition. I want to get. And so now I'm doing what I can to cut your legs out from under you. I'm jealous of you because you've done X, Y, and Z in your career. And so this was also developing within that class, and it was something that became noticed. And so it caused confusion among the general people. It caused stress. And so many of them began to seek a path that combined both outward and inward dimensions of religion, that combined the intellect and the heart. They wanted the sharia and the spiritual conduct, the suluk. They wanted this, and they found it as Sufism began to emerge. And we're not talking about at the time of Imam Al-Wasiti. This is much earlier than that, when things started to, you started to see the originators, if you will, or the pioneers of this particular area. And back then, these were the great imams, like Imam Fudail ibn Iyad and Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal, etc. They were all there in that region. Bishr al-Hafi, for example. These were all famous, pious people of earlier times, much earlier, hundreds of years before this. And of course, some of their writings were still present, circulating. The writings that focused on disciplining the heart, purification of the heart, offering counsel and wisdom, and also works that were not involved in legal arguments, disputes, not involved in the turmoil that was happening and turning people off. So of course, in certain segments of society, Sufism became popular, not only with common people, but also with the intellectuals and some of the ruling class. They turned towards Tasawwuf and the Sufi orders. And they did this initially, as I mentioned, seeking some type of purity and relief from the burdens that they were bearing. To many people, this seemed like the road to salvation, especially in a time when the religious role models had disappeared. Like the authentic religious role models had kind of disappeared. Religious authority had collapsed, and the image of the scholar was now disfigured. And these orders, these Sufi orders, they had a visible impact in society. It wasn't just about an idea or a concept, but many of them were dedicated to serving people. That became a part of their tariqah. That our tariqah is, our Sufi order is about khidmah, service. That's a means by which we get close to Allah, as we serve others. Doesn't that sound nice? I mean, that was the life of the Prophet, ﷺ, was it not? He served people. He served others. He took care of the needy and the poor and looked out for those that were oppressed. He tried to help, and he tried to save, and he would rush to give, and he advised everyone, to remove a hardship from the life of your Muslim brother is a great reward, etc. All those wonderful teachings, and now they're beginning to see a practice here, almost like a revival of sorts, because now we're not in the sittings of the elites and we're arguing and debating little issues. Some of them aren't even practical. Some of them aren't even real. Like at some point in the scholarly circles, it was, especially among the elite of the communities, that type of debate was a form of entertainment. And they would come up with legal scenarios that were not in existence. They would make things up as kind of like an intellectual exercise. If this happened, then that happened, but wait, there's a second thing and a third thing, then and they would be entertained by watching this rigor happen in front of them between the scholars. So you can see how far removed it can get from actually serving people's real life interests. And if you note from our tradition, the manner of its revelation was it came down to address the issue of the time. The Prophet ﷺ receiving revelation to address current issues. What's happening right now? According to what is most important, a set of priorities defined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then talking about things that are happening. So often Revelation's coming down to address something that's just transpired. So when you remove that that level of relevance and practicality, then it becomes obsolete. It's not needed. What's the point of this? And so now you're seeing many of these Sufi orders beginning to actually have a real on-the-ground impact with people, serving them in a time of economic hardship. So as these things intensified, as we get closer to the time of Imam Al-Wasiti, and there's all this political turmoil, and now Baghdad has been sacked and the Mongols have taken over, the need of the poor begins to grow at rapid rates, and with the government essentially in shambles, they're unable to provide the services that are needed for their community, and so there's another gap that's waiting to be filled. So the first gap was we lost that real authentic representation of Islam, a balanced approach. There's a lack of spirituality, a lack of richness and devotion. So Sufism came and filled that very quickly. And now there's this everyday lack of service and help in a very difficult time. And the Sufi orders are now saying khidmah is part of our tariqah. We're going to fill that hole as well, that gap. So you got both the you're marrying two beautiful things, spirituality with reality. Okay, real life. And in these circumstances, the message began to emerge. And it was one that would restore people's dignity. It would relieve their suffering, and it, of course, would help them draw near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know that often it's when you're going through the hardest times of your life that you become most close to Allah. You need that in order to get through the difficulties. So you start to rely heavily on your faith. And so essentially, this emergence is not one that's merely psychological, but it's an approach which has a lot to do with purifying, and it has a lot to do with showing mercy as well as receiving. And this is reflected in one of the great imams of that era, Imam Ahmed Al-Rifa'i, rahimahullah ta'ala. And he was one of the great imams of a tariqah, Imam Ahmed Al-Rifa'i. You might know Al-Rifa'iyya as a Sufi order, and which is still present till today. And this Sufi order is also known as Al-Ahmadiyya, which was Imam Wasiti's upbringing was in this particular order. So Imam Al-Rifa'i, Imam Ahmed Al-Rifa'i, one of his things is that he would go house to house and he would serve people. He would wash his own clothes by hand, essentially living a very simple life. Some said he didn't own more than one thobe at a time. Okay? And people were deeply moved by this lifestyle. He had a very humanistic, if you will, spirit. And so when people would see a model like Imam Ahmed Al-Rifa'i, they would see the behavior of piety, of morality. And when you see that, you're naturally inclined and attracted by it. And this is especially the case when justice is no longer served within the normal apparatus. The governments are not able to function as they should. For whatever reason, the judges have become corrupt. The political system is in disarray. And now you have a presence there that's an enemy. And so this is the rise of Imam Ahmed ibn Ali ibn Yahya Al-Rifa'i. He passed away in 578, by the way, of the Hijra calendar. But he essentially emerged as a living example of what asceticism looks like, sincere piety, and community service. And his presence became a turning point in the development of Sunni Sufism in Iraq. So, as I mentioned, Imam Al-Wasiti has a connection to Al-Rifa'i because of the presence of that order. Al-Rifa'i was born in a village in Ubaidah, and this is the region of Al-Bita'ih in southern Iraq in the marshlands. His family migrated from Morocco. They have Rifa'iyya in Morocco today. There are many turuq in Morocco. Probably Rifa'iyya is there. It's pretty widespread still. But that's where his parents came from, Morocco, migrating to go to this area in the marshlands. Yeah, Bita'ih, southern Iraq, which is right near Wasit. They're like neighbors out in the countryside, in the marshlands. And after his father passed away, he was raised by his maternal uncle. His maternal uncle was a religious man, so he was brought up in the obedience of Allah, and he preferred others over himself as a young boy. He was described even as in his youth as being very aesthetic. He didn't have a taste for the dunya. And it said that whenever he was mentioned, coupled with his mention was mercy, humility, and self-denial. He once said, and this is reported by Imam Al-Dhahabi, he says, the nearest path, أقرب الطريق الانكسار, is brokenness. Like that you break the ego, if you will. والذل, humility, والافتقار, and neediness. He says, وَتُعَظِّمُ أَمْرَ اللَّهِ, and that you revere the command of Allah, that you show compassion. تَشْفَقُ عَلَى خَلْقِ اللَّهِ, you show compassion to Allah's creation, and then تَقْتَدِي بِسُنَّةِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ, and you follow the sunnah of the Prophet's messenger alayhi salatu wasalam. All right, so Imam Al-Rifa'i, he wasn't like a jurist, like a faqih, but when he grew up, he was raised and trained in the Shafi'i school. That's what was prevalent in that region at the time. So it's not that he lacked knowledge in the Islamic sciences. No, he certainly knew. He wasn't at the level of like a real scholar, but he was familiar enough to have working knowledge of practices of religion, and he venerated and honored the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Couple that with excellent character, spiritual purity, and a very gentle nature, soft, and in the service of others, then you could see why people would be attracted. It's said that he would collect firewood himself and deliver it to the homes of the widows in the area. And you can imagine during that time, that number was increasing because it's wartime. So the soldiers, the men, right, during that time, women were not in the army. You're going to have a number of widows, and he would go out, collect water, collect firewood, and he would bring it, and he would give it to and deliver it to them in the service. He had a saying, he says, أَنَا حَقُّ بِالدُّونِ فَإِنِّي مِثْلُهُ دُونِ. He says, I am more deserving of lowly things, for I myself am lowly. He said he would not eat except for once every day or 2, sometimes 3 days. If a guest would visit him, he would go out to his companions. He would knock on the doors to gather food so that he could serve his guests. Basically meaning like he didn't have anything. Remember, one of his things is like self-denial. And he was also known to have an aversion to prestige. He says, أريد أن لا أريد وأختار أن لا يكون لي اختيار. He says, I want not to want, and I choose to have no choice. And whenever somebody of status or dignitary would come around in his presence, he wouldn't stand for them, and he'd say, النظر إلى وجوههم يقسي القلب. That looking at their faces alone is what will harden the heart. Now remember that scholarly class that I mentioned, they're mixing with these elites, these dignitaries, even the religious worshipers. They're surrounding themselves with the religious elite, the wealthy of their community, and they're just kind of like enjoying that environment. And he's saying, even looking at their face is going to harden your heart, let alone jumping in bed with him, if you will. And this was his level of humility. You can see that. These are just some examples that are mentioned by the great Imams like Imam Al-Dhahabi, who's authored multiple works on biographies, great individuals of the past, etc. Imam Al-Dhahabi also reports in another one, this is Sir Alam, the book I just, some of the quotes I could find, another one, Al-Ibr. He says that Imam Al-Rifa'i reached the pinnacle of humility, contentment, gentle speech, self-effacement, and inner purity. Among his companions were both the righteous and the blameworthy. When the Mongols took over Iraq, some of his followers began to engage in deviant practices and false spiritual displays, such as walking through fire, riding wild beasts, and playing with snakes, none of which were a part of the practice of Imam Al-Rifa'i or his righteous companions. Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala has clarified that Imam Al-Rifa'i was upright in his adherence to the Sharia and sincere in his humility and asceticism. He said he was a living embodiment of practical zuhud, of community service and worldly renunciation. And for this, he earned the title Al-Qudwa. Not through claims, but through his actual rank and deeds. Remember, we're missing the Qudwa. That's an important point. And I tried to kind of frame that. We're missing this example. We're missing this leadership. We're missing a representative of the faith. And now, Imam Al-Rifa'i, he got the title, Al-Qudwa. You want to see the deen? That's the deen. Right there. And so this very spiritually bland or barren landscape that we're in Iraq during this time, what it did is it created within people a reaction. And we see this happen quite often, especially now. We're living through one of these extreme reactions where like things get too far on one end and then there's this natural reaction from the populace that pulls it way over on the other side. We can't seem to find like a common, middle, moderate. We just got to, right now that thing is just swinging hard. From left to right, we can see in the extremes of in our own communities today. Right? Like the political landscape today is like we're going from far to the left, now we got to go far to the right. Can't quite seem to find a balance. And so this is what ends up happening during this era, is that they're drawn to this Tasawwuf, but because they're drawn in such a way, so attracted to it, they're also repelled by fiqh and its scholars, the fuqaha, altogether. They got a bad, bitter taste in their mouth for these people and their class. And so they begin to view Islamic sciences as a hindrance to spiritual progress. So the fuqaha, we could see, had practically divorced the religion from suluk, from the study of heart softening and development and spiritual depth. They practically did it. Now those people that are drawing towards Tasawwuf are literally divorcing it of the study of Islamic sciences beyond spiritual progress. And so as a result of that, some embraced Sufism exclusively, abandoning the pursuit of sacred knowledge altogether. And worse than that is a person choosing to do that individually. Others would assume roles of spiritual instruction and religious guidance without the proper foundations in Islamic law or scholarly training. And again, this was an overreaction to the dryness of the jurists, and this resulted in an excessive behavior on the opposite end of the spectrum. And so when you have somebody like Imam Al-Rifa'i, rahimahullah ta'ala, who is Al-Qudwa, but then now we've created another vacuum within this paradigm, we're going to begin to see the results of excessiveness and extremes, which is basically going to be deviations. And so, in spite of, or despite, I should say, the purity of what Tasawwuf, especially for the leaders of it like Imam Al-Rifa'i and others, was for them, like the sincerity that they brought to it, the level of asceticism they brought, the commitment to community service that was a means to draw near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, exemplified by Imam Al-Rifa'i and other great imams that were all on this spiritual path. It did not last. Deviation began to creep in, distortions. And this was largely in part due to the excessive view that they began to adopt in their shuyukh. They began to venerate their leaders, their sheikhs, in a way which would lead them into deviation. And they would essentially be replacing their spiritual training with the supernatural. That's right. It gets kind of freaky. It gets quite, as Imam Al-Dhahabi, as I hinted at already, I'm going to repeat this because this is important for us to kind of grasp. Because a lot of times today, well, alhamdulillah, in the the Muslim world, things have stabilized. And I do believe that as a part of the course correct for these deviations that began to really take hold in the Muslim world from Tasawwuf, there was an attempt to course correct, and we might have gone a little bit too far. Back to that real dryness where we tried to separate the spiritual sciences from the legal and doctrinal studies. Right? So it's kind of like, when the car starts to lose control, you got to not jerk hard at the wheel, because you're just going to get it to spin out. You got to hold on and ease off until eventually it comes back to center. And so that's what's happening, I think, over time, is we're getting to that point, sometimes this way, sometimes that way. But here we're having a major pull in this direction of the supernatural. Okay? At least that's where they were going. So, as I said, Imam Al-Dhahabi reports here about Imam Al-Rifa'i reaching such heights in terms of his humility and his inner purity, becoming the qudwa, if you will. After his death, his followers became a mix of righteous and corrupt individuals. And after the Mongol invasion, satanic states began to appear among them, he says, such as walking through fire. Sometimes we attribute that to other religions, that they're going to walk on fire. Lay out the coals and walk on fire. They were doing that. Riding wild beasts and playing with snakes. This is something that Imam Al-Wasiti grows up with, by the way. Witnessing it firsthand. They're playing with snakes. And sometimes they've gotten that in the churches in some places in America. They do some snake handling and stuff, These are entirely foreign to Islam. It's never reported from the Prophet ﷺ or his companions or the righteous generations that came. None of the great imams, not Imam Al-Rifa'i, none of them would have endorsed such practices. And this was also confirmed by Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. And he lays into them hard because he himself had encounters with them. He says, and he wrote a response to them. He actually had a couple of debates where he went to Wasit and engaged in debate with these Sufi orders and leaders. And his responses to al-Bata'ihiyya or al-Bita'ihiyya. Al-Bita', remember he said that's the marshlands. That's where Imam Al-Rifa'i went. Where he grew up, his parents migrating from Morocco. So he responds to them and he says it's a group affiliated with the Rifa'i path. He's passed away, obviously, okay? And he says, basically, that he was there clarifying, talking to these people. He said, although these individuals outwardly display asceticism, gentleness, and pleasant speech, they were guilty of excessiveness, innovation, idolatrous practices, turning away from the Sharia of Islam, deceit, and unlawfully consuming people's wealth, behaviors that clearly deviated from the straight path. He even stated that they resembled the Rafidah, which are like the extreme Shia in certain traits, and in some respects surpassed them in fabrications and exaggeration toward their sheikhs. He even said, لا تقولوا أكذب من اليهود على الله ولكن قولوا أكذب من الأحمدية على شيخهم. Don't say more dishonest than the Jews about Allah, but say more dishonest than the Ahmadiyya about their sheikh. Like if you really wanted to insult somebody for being a liar, you would say, you're more dishonest than the Jews about Allah. Because the Jews, they would make up all kind of things about Allah. He said, that's not a big enough insult. If you want the mother of all insults, you say more dishonest than the Ahmadiyya about their sheikh. Meaning, they used to lie about their sheikh so much, exaggerate so much that it was preposterous, unimaginable. But guess what? Many of them, the lies would sink into the common people's hearts. We're in the marshlands, bruh. We're out in the rural, like Imam Al-Wasiti says, look, dude, this community is khafif. Okay? They're simple. And there's nothing wrong with that, but they are, because they don't have exposure to all types of different things. It's not a very like complex society where you have guardrails. In a complex society, a developed society, there are guardrails because there's education there, and there's people that can easily go, whoa, hey, no, not this guy. No, wrong thing. They got somebody to quick, but out there, simple, open, innocent, and a lot of times can be very gullible to these types of things. So, of course, here he's talking about these outrageous lies that they would attribute to not only their sheikhs, but Imam Al-Rifa'i as well. And, of course, Imam Al-Rifa'i was free from these claims that they were making. So, the original asceticism of Imam Al-Rifa'i was founded on serving the poor, humbling oneself before Allah, and avoiding the people of prestige. And now, transformed into a path that chased the admiration of the masses through spectacles and illusions. He says spiritual training was no longer centered on purification and upright conduct, but rather on boastful displays of miracles, seeking blessings through sheikhs, and the pursuit of worldly breakthroughs. Worldly breakthroughs. Because of this, the sincere Sufis, among them Imam Al-Wasiti, began distancing themselves from such displays and openly criticizing these states. This is why we can see a kind of reform movement of Imam Al-Wasiti. So when you think about what we've discussed some of his works, and he talks about a little bit of the sheikh and their role. If you remember, he says that the Prophet ﷺ is the medium. Your sheikhs will guide you along the way, but the medium is always the Prophet ﷺ. He's trying to make sure pulling everybody back to the source so that they don't get lost in these exaggerations of their leaders. And this deviation in the Tariqa Rifa'iyya is not isolated, by the way. It's not just found in this particular order. This order is excelled in deviation. Even till today. Excelled in it. And we're going to look at it through the eyes of Imam Al-Wasiti, perhaps in another session. Just some of the strange practices that they would involve themselves in. You would think you're not looking at Muslims when you hear him describe the way he grew up. You think this is another religion altogether. This is like a pagan religion. You think this is like a Woodstock worshiping idols type of a thing. That's right. Yes. It gets quite deep in the mud. So other Sufi orders were suffering from the same deviations. The Rifa'iyya, this Ahmadiyya, was just like a model, essentially. And Imam Al-Wasiti and others, they had to work their way through all of that. They had to begin to reprioritize things. They had to now move from revolving around personalities to principles in their religion, pulling out of deviations. And that took a critical lens and an open heart and, of course, ultimately Allah's guidance. So if you look at Imam Al-Wasiti, rahimahullah ta'ala, as I mentioned, growing up in the Ahmadiyya Sufi environment, Ahmadiyya Rifa'iyya, this is in the city of Wasit. His father is the sheikh there. He describes his father as being one who is obeyed, like he's the head of the order in his area. But the way he's brought up is far removed from the foundations of the Islamic faith. There's no true understanding of Islam. They're not brought up with the Prophet ﷺ as their main guide. And he would reflect on this in his writings. He would talk about how painfully heedless the people were and how difficult it was for him to grow up not being able to identify Islam. He's basically, I didn't know anything about Islam. And that's because the people that he was brought up around did not represent the true essence of the faith, which is, again, from one extreme now to another. Right? If we were to consider like that extreme where you have people that know the legal code, they're just not living by it. In fact, they're undermining it constantly, and so it turns people off. And then they try and course correct to go to like a more balanced approach. But that, as it begins to pull away from the grounding of the law and starts to drift further out here, then you're going to be void of halal and haram. And that's how he described his community. He said they had utter disregard for the boundaries of halal and haram. He said the sheikhs of the environment did not instruct their followers how to perfect acts of worship, nor did they teach the obligatory rulings of purification or the prayers, the sunnah prayers. Their method was based on a form of Sufism stripped of the Sharia. Remember, we had the Sharia stripped of Tasawwuf. Now we have Tasawwuf stripped of the Sharia. And he noticed, observing that the fuqara, the disciples of the Sufi, did not know what scrupulousness was, al-wara'. They did not lower their gaze. They paid no attention to the etiquettes or ethics of the legal code, let alone the other rulings. And then, to further this type of dysfunction, they showed no respect toward the scholars. They considered a faqih to be the most hated among them. أبغض الناس الفقهاء. They despised the fuqaha. Except when they needed them for marriage. It's like much like today. They'll bring the imam for the wedding. They don't want him for anything else. They'll even bring him for the wedding ceremony with dancing and music and a DJ. They want the imam to come there, and they're able to get some of them because they'll pay a miskin who's so desperate that they'll go to these functions because they're going to give him enough money to like make him like, dude, I got to take care of my family. I'm just stuck for the law. I'm going to go. I'm going to do this. Have the whole party bumping. They want the imam. Do the nikah. Right after he's done it, music's back on. Dancing's back happening. Tabarruj. Everything's going on. That's when they needed these fuqaha. Do our marriages. Do the divorces. Make sure the business contracts are done right. Otherwise, we don't want to hear a word you have to say. And they would joke about it. If you ask them about their legal school, he said, if they said, if someone asks you what's your madhab, you say our madhab is al-ma' wal-mihrab. As a joke. Taking it as a joke. Al-ma' means water, mihrab is the prayer niche. So this is a mockery of the legal code and the methodology of learning. And so Imam Al-Wasiti, he notes that these are like symptoms of a corrupt environment, largely due to a lack of knowledge and reason. And this is where he points out. He says that most of these individuals came from the desert and from rural villages, areas where learning was scarce and reason was weak. And he notes, no prophet was ever sent from the Bedouins. He warned that the urban populations, that if they began to follow the fuqara, these are the disciples, those they're like the needy, the worshippers that often lived outside, their religious state would deteriorate and innovations and deviations would spread among them, just as happened with the Ahmadiyya. The strange practices that became widespread, such as dancing with fire, handling snakes, and engaging in condemned forms of gender mixing. Despite all of that, he did grow up in this environment. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala planted in his heart a light, the light of his fitrah, if you will, his natural inclination. And so from a young age, he noted that he felt an aversion to their condition, their state, and he was convinced that that wasn't the truth. It wasn't the truth of Islam that they claimed to have possessed, and he considered what they were doing to be disgraceful. And that this saved him, this feeling that he had, and he attributed it to the subtle blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That he had this natural inclination to turn away in order to seek knowledge. And that's what would lead him on a journey outside of his community. And that's where we're going to end for this evening. And we'll pick up here with the text that I passed out. Inshallah, we'll read a little bit from his work. You can certainly take it home, do some pre-reading as homework, and we will jump back into it the next time we meet. Jazakallah khair. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa akhiru da'wana. Alhamdulillah.